Columbiana County, Ohio, 1992. Waiting, that was the hardest part. Sitting perfectly still and just waiting. Waiting for just the right moment. If you moved too soon, you might spoil the ambush. He could take the cold. He was used to it. But the waiting to spring the trap, to make the perfect shot, that was the hardest part. An indistinct sound caught his attention. He froze. What was that? There it is again. Crack. A limb snapped. Then silence. He held his breath in anticipation. This is it. This is it. He thought to himself over and over. Just as he decided it must have been the wind, there it was again, only louder this time. He wanted to jump up and look, and start to shoot, but he knew better. He tried letting his breath out slowly, and he turned his head ever so slowly towards the sound. When he saw them, he froze. They were coming slowly and cautiously, as if they suspected an ambush at any moment. After the early shooting, he thought they'd be coming through here hard and fast. He stayed frozen until they moved again, and then he moved ever so slowly, trying to adjust his body and bring his gun to bear without giving himself away. He matched their movement perfectly, and after what seemed like hours instead of only a few minutes, he was in a good position to see his quarry and fire. There were 3 of them, 2 good-sized mature does and a yearling. Damn, he thought as a slight disappointment filled him. No antlers. The disappointment didn't lessen the anxiety as he watched the beautiful animals sniff the air and move ever so cautiously past him. For a moment he thought about taking a shot. Hell, you can't eat antlers, but a nice trophy buck sure would look good on his wall, not to mention boost his morale after all the bad shit that had been coming down. He let the does pass, then breathed easier, still taking care to move as little as possible. There may be a buck following. His mind wandered as he relaxed into his routine again. He wondered if the rush he felt was anything like what his brother felt on an ambush when he was on a mission. It was probably similar because, after all, hunting was hunting. It was probably 100 times greater because, after all, deer didn't shoot back like men did. That must be why so many vets he knew that had been in the deep shit didn't hunt anymore. It made sense. It was sure good to see Sean and get things back on track again. Right after his father died, he thought he was coming to hate his brother. He was glad they had worked it out. Eric squeezed his eyes tight at the slight headache he had. He had some Advil in his pocket, but right now he was comfortable not moving. Boy, they had had some weekend, he thought, thinking back. It seemed like it was what they both needed. For 3 days they had eaten, talked of their childhood, and drank God knows how many cases of beer. No wonder he had a headache. On Sunday they laid off on the booze and rested, both men wanting to be their best come Monday. They had just parted a few hours ago as Eric was getting ready to go hunting and Sean had to get on the road to Washington, D.C. for his meeting. It seemed ironic to Eric that he was leaving with the gun and his brother was going to look for a job. They had embraced as they both left Eric's tiny apartment. It had felt good to Eric. Late Saturday night, when they were both pretty drunk, Sean had told Eric he needed a change, an adventure. Something to get his blood moving again, to make him feel alive. You never had the chance to live, kid. You've been tied to that factory since you were 18, 19. Let's both make a new start together. You and me, kid. Open up your life to something new. Different. Hell, anything. But let's do it together. We'll kick ass and take names later. Hell, kid, you and me. We'll conquer the world or something. I can see it now. The Murphy brothers. Kings of the world. Eric laughed to himself, remembering they had toasted to themselves. Long live the kings, Sean toasted. Then his head had dropped to the table, out cold. It sounded good to hear Sean tell it, but the truth was, Eric had to admit to himself, though he'd never admitted to his brother, Eric was a little afraid. He was afraid he couldn't cut it on his own, away from his nice, safe job. Sean was used to living on the edge. The strength and confidence showed in his face. The freedom Sean talked of sounded great to Eric, but the idea of it intimidated the hell out of him. Sean had said, Eric, you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You're stronger than I am. You just don't know it. Eric didn't believe him. Sorry, big brother, he whispered out loud. I guess the self-confidence just wasn't nurtured in me in the same way it was you. He felt less alone now, after this weekend with Sean, than he had for years. Since the kids were little, he figured. In their mid-teens now, they seemed as indifferent to him most of the time as their mother did. Since the divorce, they barely spoke to him, unless they wanted something or knew he was buying them a present. How had he drifted so far from everybody he cared for? Maybe Sean was right. Maybe his job was killing him or driving him crazy, or both. He didn't know if running off with Sean on some wild adventure was the answer either. He had 15 years invested with WWM, and $18 an hour jobs just didn't grow on trees anymore, especially without a college degree. Crack. A limb snapped, sounding like a rifle shot, snapping Eric instantly back to the present. Eric froze, cursing himself inwardly, realizing he had been speaking out loud. His eyes grew wide as he realized that in front of him, about 30 yards away, was the most magnificent buck he had ever encountered, at least a 12-point. His tines were long and thick, with a spread of at least 20 inches. He snorted and pawed at the ground, his breath coming out his nostrils like a cloud of steam. He must have heard me, Eric thought, as the buck tossed his head and pawed the ground trying to get a reaction from Eric. Eric had been hunting long enough to know that if the buck hadn't run yet, that if he held perfectly still and didn't flinch, there was a good chance the buck would move off slowly, giving Eric a better chance at getting a good shot. Eric willed himself not to move. His chest ached and it felt as if his heart stopped, but he knew it was still beating because he could hear it pounding so loud in his ears he was afraid the buck would hear it too. The buck lowered his head and sniffed the doe's trail, but kept his eyes on Eric. Then he looked away for a moment, but suddenly snapped his head back around to see if he could catch him moving. Eric remained motionless through this whole routine. The buck started to move off slowly, but kept a watchful eye on Eric. He began to slowly circle Eric's position to get back to the doe's trail. When the buck passed behind a large tree, Eric took the moment to raise his shotgun. Eric clicked off the safety and the buck stopped cold behind the tree. Eric cursed himself again, but he held his aim where he thought the buck would emerge from behind the tree. After a minute or two, or 3, the 12-gauge seemed like it weighed 50 pounds. Eric was beginning to think the buck had moved off, using the tree to cover his escape, when he took 1, then 2, hesitant steps into view. Eric watched in awe, fully respecting the beauty and magnificence of the animal. Carrying his head high, with antlers displayed about his head like a crown, his grayish-brown coat blending with the winter colors of the woods and his gray-white muzzle with his black nose sniffing the air about him, he seemed aware and in control. Eric had a perfect side shot as the buck emerged fully from behind the tree. Eric took aim slightly behind and above what he thought of as the deer's front elbow, the point where he knew the beast's heart was located, low in his wide chest. Eric took a breath and held it. His heart seemed to be pounding so hard now, he thought it would burst, and blood roared through his ears, sounding like a train. "Oh God, let me make this shot. Oh God, let me make this shot," he repeated silently to himself. He waited. Easy now. Easy. He willed himself to relax. He started to slowly let his breath out, and he squeezed the trigger. Kaboom! The big 12-gauge thundered, sending the 1-ounce slug flying, and Eric flinched involuntarily. The buck seemed to stagger for an instant, but then it turned on its heel and bounded off the way it had come with amazing speed. Eric pumped the action of his shotgun, chambering another round. He took aim for another shot, noting with satisfaction that the buck's fluffy tail was down, not up like a white flag, a good indication of a hit. Just as Eric sighted for his second shot, the buck stumbled once, then fell headlong, plowing his forelegs, then face into the snow. He thrashed his legs and rolled over like a big dog wanting his belly rubbed, then was still. Eric lowered his gun, shaking with excitement. He had done it. He had bagged the biggest trophy of his life and he hadn't screwed it up. He wanted to shout and run to the downed deer, but he forced himself to stand still and calm down. More than one hunter has lost what he thought was a sure kill by running up on a downed buck immediately with his gun on safe or not loaded, only to find the animal was only stunned or lightly wounded and have it run off or attack him. After 5 long minutes, Eric made his way slowly over to where the buck had been when he took his shot. He found where the tracks ended and saw where the buck staggered when the slug struck him. No blood, just a tuft of fur on the snow. Eric followed the buck's tracks with his eyes. The buck had turned and leapt there. The snow was stained, bright red, spraying out 10 or 12 feet from the tracks. A clean heart shot. Eric smiled inwardly to himself. It was an easy trail to follow, even without being able to see the deer. He made his way slowly to where the animal lay dead in the snow, his heart pumped dry. Eric felt proud, happy. This is the best I've felt in a couple years, he thought. Then fleetingly felt sad that he had to kill this magnificent creature to feel better. He wished Sean was here. He may tease him about hunting, but he knew his brother would understand and feel proud for him. Maybe, just maybe, Eric thought, This is a sign my luck is changing for the good, for once. Chester's Gap, Virginia, 1865. Wilt Binford had helped both James Keith and Francis Yates secure a bar of gold in their gear. When they heard the shouts and the pounding of the horses' hooves, they drew their pistols and waited for a tense moment, expecting to see Yankees come boiling over the rise and overwhelm them. Then they heard the sharp report of a volley of gunfire, followed by screams and a ragged but more intense volley in answer. "Sounds like Charlie's plan's working," a nervous-sounding James Keith said. "Well, let us not be giving them any time to change in their minds," Francis Yates added. "Listen," Wilt said. "The yelling and the shots is getting further away." "Yep, they's a-going for it good, all right." "Yeah." Wilt snapped the reins and the wagon jerked, then creaked forward as they started up the grade through Chester's Gap. Following behind the wagon, both Yates and Keith looked back to the now distant sounds of battle. "Francis," Keith asked unsure, "you think we got a chance to make it back with this here broken down wagon? If'n we get through this gap here afore those Yankees noticed they had been had, I'm thinking maybe, just maybe better'n half." They reached the summit of the gap sometime later without further incident or signs of pursuit, so they stopped to rest the horses from the long heavy pull and check the wagon. They looked to the valley beyond and felt like they were home free, even though they knew they still had a long, dangerous route ahead. They all breathed a sigh of relief as they started down the other side of the gap. This valley was home. They knew the people, they had friends and allies here. It would be slow going, but their confidence was growing with each passing mile, until they came to the spot where Albert Willis had been hanged. Uneasiness came over the trio then, each man realizing that death could be lurking nearby, even in friendly surroundings. Virgil and Eli rode at the head of Virgil's men as they galloped up the mountain. "How much further?" Virgil yelled to Eli over the thunder of the galloping horses. "Just ahead, those sons of bitches!" Eli wailed. Virgil followed his look and saw a lone man picking over a body up ahead in the road. The scavenger took to his horse and tore off headlong down a narrow road to the east. Eli drew his pistol, tried to aim, and pegged a wild shot at the fleeing horseman, shouting, "Get that son of a bitch!" The men saw the half-dozen bodies strewn in the roadway as they turned left to follow their rider. Thinking of the gold and revenge for dead men in the crossroads, they rode headlong into McDowell's ambush. Thinking back on it later, Virgil realized in the heat of the moment how easily they had been taken. 1 minute, they had been ready to overtake the lone rider. The next minute, Virgil's men were toppling from their horses like flies, shot down by only a half-dozen or so pistol-wielding guerrillas, who appeared amongst them like apparitions, shooting down almost half their number, then fleeing down the road to the east away from the crossroads and Chester's Gap. Fueled by anger, revenge, and a lust for gold, Eli and Virgil followed his men. A few miles further on, it hit Virgil in the head like a brick, and he called a halt. Eli was furious, wheeling his horse around and baring his teeth at Virgil like a rabid dog. "What the hell are you doing, Virgil? We gotta stay after them," he hollered. "No, Eli, no. Think, where's the wagon?" Eli looked around, disoriented and confused. "It's up ahead with those murdering bastards." "No, Eli." Virgil shook his head slow. "You said you had a wheel slowing you up." "No. If the wagon had come this way, we'd have caught it by now. It could not outrun us even with a good wheel. They drew us into an ambush to lead us away from the gold, and we fell for it, following our anger." Eli's features slackened, seeing his brother's logic. "We have to get back to the gap where they took the wagon, on the road to Front Royal, and find which way they went. Hurry, Virgil. We must make all haste." Eli went to spur his mount back the way they had come, but Virgil stopped him. "Eli, get a hold of yourself. The horses are spent. If we try riding back that hard, we'll kill the horses and won't be any further ahead than we are now. Think, man, think. We have to be as crafty as our adversaries, or they will surely run us to ground." Just then, shots rang out. Seeing the Yankees had given up the chase, the guerrillas turned to attack again. The groaning wheel grew louder and louder until they couldn't ignore it any longer. They stopped as the sun was setting to take a final look before dark. All three men looked the wheel over, though all were reluctant to say what they felt. Finally, Wilt spoke up, shaking his head. "It ain't gonna make it." The others nodded their heads in agreement. "We trying to push on at night will draw attention to ourselves for miles. Any Yankee pickets or patrols will hear it for sure," Yates said. "I got an idea," Wilt offered. "Well, let's hear it, boy. Daylight's a-fadin'." Well, Wilt started tentatively, we ain't that far from the Connell place where I stay sometimes. One time the Yankees came a-searchin', and I had to light out and hide in the woods. They searched and searched the woods and all, but never found me, even almost walking on top of me. Wilt paused, but James Keith motioned for him to go on. Well, anyway, I come across this little cave and hid down in it. And, well, I guess I'm trying to say is it ain't that far from here. We could hide the gold down there and ride to the Connell place. Fix the wagon or borrow theirs. Come back tomorrow, or tomorrow night, or meet up with the others and come back here together. I hear Connell sets a fair table, and his daughter's right pretty, James Keith chided, knowing young Wilt Binford was sweet on her. Don't go talking about Myra Connell. She's spoken for, Wilt said in a menacing tone, with his face getting red. Both older men laughed at Wilt's discomfort. Don't go getting riled. Jim's just funnin' ya, Francis Yates chuckled. Well, it ain't fair. Y'all funnin' me all the time just 'cause I'm younger than everybody else, Wilt pouted. Well, all funnin' aside, kid, you come up with some good ideas for a youngin', Francis Yates offered. And a hot meal and sleeping at the Connell's place sounds a lot more pleasing than freezing out here all night. If you think you can find that cave, Wilt, you go on ahead and lead on. I'll take the team. Indeed, before darkness fell in the tricky light of dusk, Wilt led them no more than a quarter-mile down the road guided by landmarks that only Wilt could discern. He cut off the road for 100 yards or so and pointed to a spot where a large oak stood angled against the steeply rising rocky hill. Both older men looked at each other, then followed Wilt over to where he had pointed. The entrance to the cave was a space low to the ground, between two exposed, gnarled roots of oak. It didn't look large enough for an animal, let alone a man, to hide himself. Both Francis and Jim looked into the opening. Doubtfully, Francis shook his head, saying, "You sure this is it, boy? It don't seem to go nowhere." Wilt beamed a confident smile in the rapidly fading light. "You just watch," he said, as he grabbed hold of the top root and slipped his body into the opening between the roots, feet first. Wilt disappeared from sight. James Keith put his head in the hole and looked back at Francis Yates, saying, "Where'd he go?" Then they heard Wilt's voice laughing at them. "See, it drops off in here. You can even look in, and it doesn't look like nothing. Can't see anyone all the way inside." The two older men nodded their agreement and told Wilt to stay put. They would carry the gold over and hand it down to him, and he could stack it in the cave. It was long after dark when the two older men pulled Wilt from the cave. "I thought y'all said we done loaded up the rest of the gold," Wilt said, motioning to the 6 bars glinting in the rising moonlight. "Now listen up, Wilt," Francis intoned. "Me and Jim here figures us 3 deserves another share off the top. Nobody knows how much we took. We don't figure anybody else will know the difference if you, Jim, and me grabbed us each 2 more. We still got Walter's horse to carry the extra weight, and y'all know as well as I do if it was Nick Carter or Charlie McDough in our place, we'd be lucky if they even showed up at Blackwell's to divvy it up." Wilt couldn't disagree with their logic. "But it still don't seem right somehows," Wilt said nervously. "Then you can toss your 2 down the hole, boy, but you better know to keep your mouth shut, or you might just have an accident," James Keith threatened. "I'll go on with you. You don't have to worry about me none. Just seems funny is all. Cheating the boys we fight side by side with. Don't feel bad, boy. Most any of them would cheat you given the chance. Especially that bunch we pulled this raid with," Francis consoled. "Hell, kid, this here war ain't gonna last forever. Hide it, and use it to give you and that gal there you're sweet on a leg up." Wilt looked between the 2 men and agreed. He still didn't like it much, but he had the notion if he didn't agree with their plans, he wouldn't live to tell anyone anyway. Plus, if it helped him win Myra once and for all, he figured he could live with it. They improvised a way to carry the gold with oil skins and boards from the crate, and they made 2 primitive pack saddles and divided the gold between Walter's and Wilt's horses since they were the freshest, having not been ridden since morning. They headed off towards the Connell place with their lightened wagon and their loaded down pack horses. They made better time now that the wagon was lighter, and they weren't concerned if it broke. They arrived at the Connell place a short time later and found it deserted. Colin Connell had taken a fall and broken his leg. Being a large man, it had taken his wife Sarah, his daughter Myra, and their Negro hand Harrison to load him up in the wagon and take him to Doc Payne in Paris. The men tended to their horses, then boldly made themselves at home in the house. They built a fire in the large stone fireplace and got warm for the first time in days. James Keith found a cured ham in the smokehouse, and all 3 laid out their bedroll in front of the fire and fell into a heavy sleep. Wilt awoke suddenly, bathed in sweat. He had had a bad dream and it left him with an eerie premonition. He got out of his bedroll and checked outside. Where were the Connells? He wondered absently. He looked to the east and noted it was some time before dawn. He pulled on his boots and donned his coat and went out into the crisp midnight chill to relieve himself. While he was outside, his feeling of foreboding grew stronger. After he had done his business, he made his way out to the lean-to that had been fashioned by what was left of the barn. Sheridan's men had burned the barn itself the fall before as part of the Scorched Valley campaign. Once there, he checked the horses. Then, able to wait no longer, he checked the gold. It was still there, but something was still nagging at him. An idea came to him, and he heaved one of the heavy bars and carried it back to the house. Heavy and cold, he thought. Back inside, he was careful not to wake the other two. Pausing only a moment, Will carried the bar upstairs to Myra's room. He entered slowly. He had only been up there once before when he and Myra had been alone at the house. That one and only time. He thought of her now and felt all warm inside. He moved the table by her bed and lit the oil lamp there. He took a piece of paper and drew a crude map of where the gold was hidden and wrote a short note to Colonel Mosby about the raid and what had gone on. He set the gold bar on the table and looked at it flickering in the lamplight. It seemed to waver and move. It almost seemed alive. He then wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth with a note to the colonel, then lifted the rug by the bed and pulled a loose board Myra had shown him. Down inside the space was a small strong box where Myra kept her most treasured possessions. A heart-shaped locket Wilt had given her, his love notes, and her diary. Wilt carefully and silently lifted the lid and placed his package inside. He put everything back the way it had been and stole silently back downstairs to his bedroll. Neither of the other two men had awakened, so Wilt slipped back into his bedroll, his conscience eased. When Wilt awoke in the morning, Francis had the fire going again and a pot of grits simmering. "About time, boy," he said, grinning. "Food's almost ready. We'll have grits and more of that smoked ham. Get your gear squared away so we can be off after breakfast." Wilt rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and he busied himself readying his gear. He went out and found James Keith tending the horses. He helped him rub them down, then they saddled all 4 horses, loading the gold all on Walter's horse. "That's too much weight for one animal, Jim," Wilt volunteered. "Hell, kid, we only gotta go far enough to hide it. It ain't like we're gonna take it all the way back to Blackwell's." Just then Francis called from the house. Breakfast was ready, so they eagerly went in to eat. They all ate another hearty meal and cleaned up, each leaving $1 in the kitchen and a note to thank the Connells for the food and lodging, even though they weren't there. "Wonder where they could have got to," Wilt asked, wondering aloud as they left the house. "Somebody sick, most likely, and either they went to tend them or they took them to the dock." Wilt silently hoped Mira was all right as they mounted up to leave. "Wilt, you lead the pack horse since you was so worried about it," James said, handing a shovel to Francis, who was already mounted. "Be some hard digging with the ground froze," Francis observed. "Hey, Wilt, you know any other handy little hidey holes?" They all chuckled. Wilt moved over to check their makeshift pack on Walter's horse. James Keith mounted up, and Francis called to Wilt. "Boy, we're gonna ride ahead and scout a spot. I got a couple places in mind. Take the road down by Carter Run, follow downstream. We'll be along in there somewhere with easy landmarks so we can find it after the war. That way if one of us don't make it, the other two can split it. Follow along when you can, kid, but be quick about it." With a yell they were off down the lane. Wilt busied himself checking the cinches, making sure everything was tight. Then he too mounted up. He took the reins of the pack horse, but the big mare was reluctant to follow and resisted. I know, it's heavy, girl," Wilt coaxed. "But we don't have far to go. It'll be all right, Wilt promises." Wilt spoke in easy, soothing tones, and slowly he got the horse to follow. Wilt started down the lane, noticing for the first time how bright the day was starting out. "Maybe a warm one for January," he spoke out loud to the horse. He took a deep breath of fresh morning air and exhaled loudly. "Ah, good sign," he said. Shots rang out. Wilt snapped his head up and looked off in the distance. "Yankees!" he yelled out loud. He saw a column galloping down the road, with some splitting off through a field to head off Francis and Jim, who were rushing back up the lane for cover. Wilt turned to urge his mounts back, his mind racing. Can't get caught up with this gold. His eyes came to rest on the old well on the east side of the house. It was stone, with a little roof over it, and a rope and bucket hanging down. He thought of the times he and Myra had sat together on the stone wall of the well making wishes. As his mind raced, he jumped from his horse with his rifle in one hand and the reins of the pack horse in the other. He dropped the rifle and pulled the horse next to the well. Drawing his knife, he cut the lashings in the oilskin on one side. The heavy gold tumbled down the landing of the wall, falling inside the well. The horse struggled and reared with its load suddenly off balance, but Wilt managed to turn the horse and slash the other side, freeing the mare from the heavy load, then slapping her rump so she'd run off. Wilt then heaved the bars that hadn't fallen inside the well down into its depths. Picking up his rifle, he ran into the house and stormed up the steps to Myra's room. He looked out the window and saw the Yankee riders were closing fast on Francis and Jim. He broke out the window pane with the rifle stock, took careful aim on the lead Yankee and fired, tumbling the Yankee from his horse. He reloaded quickly. Francis and Jim were almost back to the house. Wilt raised his rifle to fire again as James Key threw up his arms, arched his back, and slid off the back of his horse and lay still. Wilt cursed and fired, dropping another Yankee soldier. Francis made it to the safety of the house, stormed inside, and returned fire from a downstairs window. "Good shooting, Wilt," Francis yelled up the stairs. Wilt reloaded and fired again. He could see the rest of the column coming up fast. "Francis, you okay?" he yelled down. "They winged me, kid, but I still got some fight left in me." Wilt saw the Yankees moving to flank the house. In moments they'd be surrounded. The ones in the front were taking cover behind the low stone wall in the front yard and beginning to return fire toward the house. Wilt's feeling of foreboding returned. He sat at Myra's table and scrawled her a quick note. "My dearest Myra, things ain't looking up right now. Always remember I love you. When you find this, I will be dead. See that Colonel Mosby gets the note I left and sees the package. It's our dreams. You can find 'em in the wishing well. Love, Wilt." "Wilt, here they come! Start shooting for Christ's sakes!" Francis yelled, desperation sounding in his voice. Wilt saw the Yankees charge in the house. Glass shattered as the firing began, and Francis's six-shooters thundered downstairs. Wilt quickly lifted the board and put his note to Myra in her strongbox, and hastily put the board in place and dropped the rug. He looked out the window as a volley of shots hit all around it, forcing him to dive to the floor. He quickly loaded his rifle and fired again as the sound of a dozen angry hornets buzzed through the room. He drew his pistols and started firing. The Yankees were almost to the porch when Wilt heard Francis yell, "I'll see you damn Yankees in hell!" Then he heard the door and saw Francis run off the porch into the midst of the charging Yankees with both six-shooters blazing. Yankees dropped all around him until his guns emptied. Then Wilt watched horrified as a Yankee officer, still with a saber, took a savage swing at Francis's head. "No!" Wilt screamed, just having reloaded his Colts. He jumped through the window and onto the roof of the porch, and fired into the Yankee officer who'd just taken off Francis's head. He leapt to the ground screaming a rebel yell at the top of his lungs, and emptied the two Colts in his hands, drew the other two he had and started firing them. When the first bullet spun him around, he fell, then fought his way to his feet while he continued to empty his remaining pistols. Another bullet hit him. They seemed to be spinning him around and around. Wilt wondered if he'd ever finish falling. "This ain't so bad," he thought. "It don't hurt one bit." As he finally dropped and came to a rest on his back looking up at the blue sky, he could see Myra's window and hoped she'd forgive him for breaking it. It sure would have been nice to see her again. He thought of her pretty face, her smile, and the way she smelled like honeysuckle, almost like she was there. Her image was the last thing he saw as he died with a smile on his face, his last thought that lingered in his head, even moments after he died. "It happened just like the dream I had last night."